I'm just curious, is there anyone who did catch the video performance, the Skype thing, last year at this time, 1 year ago, minus 2 weeks? It was really rather distressing for my wife and myself. My wife's over here. We got to the airport, and the woman said, where are you going today? And we said, Dublin. She said, not today, you aren't. But that was the very beginning of the volcano consideration. So here we are, almost a year later, and very happy to talk about one of my favorite subjects, which is the interaction between mathematics and art, and in particular, the interaction between mathematicians and artists, even more particular, between me and Salvador Dali. Okay? Salvador Dali is the most unusual person I've ever met, including mathematicians, which is saying something for people who have maths background. So what I'd like to do is talk about the variation on the topic, the many minds and dimensions of Salvador Dali. And we are in the science gallery, so science and art, and in particular Dali, are a particular interest. And at the end of this, as I said, after we finish the presentation, about 50 minutes, and have a question and answer period, there will be a showing of an interesting film that was made in the 100th anniversary of Dali's birth. He was born in 1904, so 7 years ago. A documentary was made called The Dali Dimension. It really featured the fact that Dali had, throughout his life, an interest in all sorts of scientific topics. And as he went through different periods and concentrated on different aspects, he went through psychology and physics and biology and mathematics. I'm going to concentrate mostly on the mathematics part, but to see the full 50-minute video, please come again. In fact, as a teaser, we're going to show you the introduction to the Dali dimension.
Dali en el momento de salir del huevo.
This is the image that people usually have of Salvador Dali, a strident, eccentric artist, fond of provocation and money. But there's another Dali behind the mask. A consummate artist who, like the Renaissance masters, aspired to merge art and science. Dali's work reflects the main scientific theories and discoveries of the 20th century.
Los pensadores y literatos no me pueden aportar absolutamente nada, y los científicos todo, incluso la inmortalidad del alma.
I had the feeling Dali wanted to know what my mindset was. As I looked at the same objects he was looking, what kinds of questions was I asking, how was I using it? We always spoke pretty much as equals. To see the rest of this film, you'll have to come back again. The story actually begins, of course, much before my first meeting with Dali, but both for Dali and myself, the next slide will show, I hope. Yes. The beginning one of the most interesting sequences, from my point of view, of Dali's work. In the 1950s, he returned to some of the themes that he had studied earlier, but some of the geometric themes and some of the religious themes. But in 1950, there was a whole sequence of paintings that were based on religious themes, and in particular, the Crucifixion. This is the first of that sequence, and it's called the Christ of St. John of the Cross, actually based on an image that they found that's attributed to St. John of the Cross. And it's an exercise in perspective, in this case, showing the crucifixion from the point of view of God the Father, something we don't get a chance to see. But this in itself represents what a sequence, an idea that Dali used again and again, which is that you get people's attention by changing the perspective, in some ways, perspectives that are impossible from a real person. And in the beginning, when they were talking about the different scientific aspects, we passed mathematics very quickly, but mathematics very quickly was based on this particular figure. This figure, in 1954, was titled Corpus Hypercubicus, Body on the Hypercube, by Dali. So he certainly knew that he was using and incorporating a really very, very standard mathematical figure, but he also obviously had some kind of intuition that we were working with a theological object at the same time. Relationships of mathematics and theology were supposed to be mutually illuminating one another. I was very curious about this because, as it happens, I was interested in that figure for a totally different reason. And if we go to the book, Visualizing, or Beyond the Third Dimension, written in 1991, this is one of the sequences where I told about this story and the background for it. And this is the only real dimensional sequence I'm showing, but it really is underlying the entire way we study dimensions, the many dimensions of Salvador Dali in particular. The top shows a sequence of 4 rods. And you could give somebody those 4 sticks next to each other and ask him or her to make a square. Now, you can't do it if you stay in the line. But if you go outside the line, we can easily fold them into a square in the plane. So going from the line to the plane enables you to solve something that you can't solve if you stay on the line by itself. The next thing is something relatively significant and relatively familiar. I have here a cube. Well, it's not a cube yet, but it's a cube if you send it to your friend in the mail. And what else would you have to send along in order to help your friend assemble? Some assembly required. Instructions, right? They have tape, that's all right, but instructions they need. The instructions say you have to paste this side to this side, and this to this, and this to this, and this to this. And you can do that just by going into the third dimension, and you have that top one that flips over to become the top. So we have a perfectly fine cube. And your friend, having received this flat object and the instruction set, could put it together, and what he or she would obtain would be the original cube you had, maybe turned inside out. That's the only ambiguity, okay? So, indeed, a two-dimensional object with instructions can represent a three-dimensional object, and there's quite a bit you could actually do about the geometry of the cube without putting it together. But the best thing to do is to go into a higher dimension to assemble it. Well, once you get started with a one-dimensional thing solved in 2-space and a two-dimensional thing that can be solved if you go to 3-space, the next thing the mathematician would ask is, well, what's the analog in the next dimension? So instead of a square surrounded by squares with an extra top, at the bottom you have a figure called an unfolded hypercube. It's a cube surrounded by cubes. So we have one in the center, then you have 6 more, and then one at the bottom, which ultimately is going to be folded across the top when you put it together. Now, that was around for a long time, and at this, my thesis at Berkeley had to do with building polyhedral models in 4, 5, and 6-dimensional space. And since I couldn't do that very easily, that was before computers were readily available, I made models with instructions. The model I had was really a little bit better than that block model, which is harder to get through airport security. Nobody gave me any trouble with this. But what happens is that you can fold it up or you can fold it down. And this, as I say, was an essential part of my PhD thesis with Professor Chern at Berkeley. And here it is. Okay? This is an unfolded four-dimensional cube. I removed a few faces for easy folding, but you can imagine a cube surrounded by cubes, 6 cubes, and the bottom thing here is ready to be flipped over once we put it together. But putting it together requires that you assemble. The green part has to go to the green part here, the yellow part to the yellow part, the blue part to the blue part. You can actually put those together. But then you still have to put the reds to the red, and this yellow to yellow. And you can't put it together in three-dimensional space. You really have to go to a higher dimension to put this together. You couldn't assemble this object with its instruction set any more effectively in three-dimensional space than you could put this object together and stay in the plane. In any case, I was giving lectures around the country and to mathematics clubs and mathematics lectures and conferences and so forth about this object. Various people would send me things to tell me about their impression of it. An artist friend from Valencia in Spain sent me this and said, this is over the Mediterranean, he said, "I'll bet you don't know that your hypercube flies." It's a kite, it goes straight up. And so, again, it was very, very nice to get people to tell me their impressions of my object when they saw it. And indeed, as these things happen, I got interviewed by a man named Tom Zito in the Washington Post in 1974, I think it says there, January, and that's me, okay, holding my little model, visual images and shadows from the fourth dimension. The person who interviewed me wanted to know about what this is good for, and I told about how physicists like the fourth dimension, although they're interested in space-time, and I was interested in space-space, how biologists and economists were interested in the fourth dimension, but what he picked up on was that artists are interested in it, and indeed, they had a little clip there of the corpus hypercubicus. I worried about that a little bit because I knew, since I was interviewed on one day and this appeared the next morning, that they had not got permission to use that picture. Dali was well known to love publicity, but under his own terms, right? So, let's see. So, what happened is that the picture also, I'll indicate that there was long enough to have another picture of me, but a picture of what we were doing at the time. This is 1974, and starting in 1967-68, I met Charles Strauss, a young PhD in mathematics and computer science, who had a three-dimensional blackboard. You could really move things around on it and see things changing. Well, not right away. You could make one picture and then another picture and another picture, capture it and make a little film. This picture here is a four-dimensional cube. An ordinary three-dimensional cube has 8 corners, and this has 16 corners. Well, every time you go up a dimension, you double. That's another story. But the picture we have here had some after images in it. The artists like this. Artists like the idea that you have a picture, but the picture represents a stage in something moving or growing, and you can see that by having some after images. So this appeared in the book, the Fourth Dimension and Non-Euclidean Geometry in Modern Art, an 880-page thesis in art history by Linda Dalrymple Henderson, then at Yale University, now at the University of Texas. And she and I have really worked on several different topics, in particular Dali, since then, because art historians really want to know what happens when an artist uses a symbol from outside the art field, in particular a mathematical field. So this is, again, from her work. Now, the real problem is, as I said, we gave them permission to use this picture. A couple of weeks after this appeared, I got a phone call. Actually, I came back from class, and there was one of these little slips of paper that was in my mailbox. This is before cell phones. And it said, "Call so-and-so in New York representing Salvador Dali." I asked Charles, my colleague, and he said, "Well, it's either a hoax or a lawsuit." And I called up, and a woman answered and said, I'm Salvador Dali's appointment secretary. Senor Dali is in New York City. He wants to meet you. So I said to Charles, what do you think? He said, well, it's either a hoax or a lawsuit, but the worst we can get out of it is a good story. So that's what I'm telling you right now, a good story. And there he is. That's Dali on the right. Okay. Yeah, gee, it's not that long ago, but maybe it is. In 35 years, things change. You can't buy that auburn hair dye anymore, for example. No, it's he was, as I say, the most unusual person I've met. We were meeting in a cocktail lounge in the St. Regis Hotel, where he had rented 2 suites, one for himself and Gala, his wife, and the other to use as a studio. Okay? He invited us, and as Charles pointed out, we were seated in ideal places to talk to him. We were the ambassadors from mathematics land in the royal court of Dali. It really was quite fascinating. He turns out, was not interested in copyrights. He was interested in picking our brains for his latest project, which was a project in science. He had just completed a whole series of holographic paintings, and he was moving on to stereoscopic oil paintings. He wanted to talk about Fresnel lenses and different ways of projecting things so people could get the experience. And, well, we answered as best we could, and at a certain stage, I decided, well, if he's asking us, I'll ask him. And I asked him for the reason behind his painting. I really wanted to know how he painted it, why he painted it, and really how it was constructed. And he began to tell me. So that was a rather interesting, fascinating thing. His answer was Raymond Law. And I said, can you say a little bit more? As a matter of fact, what I said to him was, you mean Raymond Law, the 12th and 13th century polymath in Catalonia? And he said, yes, you know Raymond Law. I said, well, coincidentally, yes. I was sitting in on a course. I used to take courses every once in a while to get away from mathematics. It's very hard. I mean, to get away. I was taking a course on the history of the church in Spain and Italy in the 12th and 13th century. And sure enough, Raymond Law came up there as a person who had written all sorts of theology and poetry and mathematics. The mathematics was rather strange from our point of view, but rather interesting. And so I knew about Raymond Law, and that fascinated Dali, and I was fascinated that he knew Raymond Law. And so that actually began to put us together. Raymond Law was much more ambitious than most modern mathematicians. He was interested in enneagrams, which have come back into fashion, but he needed to have a 9-sided polygon and had no trouble at all constructing that, even though we know now that you can't do it. So there's a lot he did. The Ars Magna he did was a kind of a combinatorial way of answering all possible questions by moving cycles around. Okay? Really interesting kind of concept. One of the things he was interested in doing was working with cubes, and of course this was something I perked up on right away. Dali went on to say that there was more to it because there was a whole Lullian movement, and 3 centuries later, Juan de Herrera, a disciple of Lullian mathematics and metaphysics, decided to take the 2-dimensional work of Dali, of Law, up into the 3rd dimension. He was an architect. In fact, the architect of El Escorial. Many people have been there. He used Lullian principles to, Dali using the cube over and over again, to construct essentially a movement from 2nd to the 3rd dimension. Dali himself painted a picture with homage to Juan de Herrera. Here it is. And there's no art historian who has observed the fact that this is a representation, another representation of the hypercube. If you look at a long hallway, it might be a cube, or if you look into a cubical box, the back looks like a small square connected to a larger square. It's a representation on our retina, a 2-dimensional representation of a 3-dimensional perspective drawing. And this is a representation of a 3-dimensional perspective drawing of a 4-dimensional object. So instead of a small square and a large square, it's a small cube and a large cube. And the corners are connected by Juan, all the way out, because this kind of thing was a representation of what Juan de Herrera did when he took up the square from Lowell into his Discurso sobre la figura cúbica, his discourse on the cubic form. Okay, so here we were with 12th and 13th century Lowell, Juan de Herrera 3 centuries later, both in Catalonia, and 3 or 4 centuries later in Catalonia, Salvador Dali taking the thing from not the second to the third, but from the third to the fourth dimension. I was really impressed with the fact that he was starting with something which was philosophical. But as a matter of fact, that's not quite what happened. And there was an interesting sidelight to that. Dali fascinated a lot of people, and there were some people who collected his work. A. Reynolds Morse and Eleanor Morse collected a large portion of his, about 10% of his total output at one particular time. They actually ended up putting it into a museum, which ended up in Tampa, St. Petersburg, Florida. Well worth going to because they have a number of really nice pieces. But one of the things that A. Reynolds Morse did was put together the relevant books. He found out about Dali's working library. And he didn't get those books, but he got copies of these various books, including Juan de Herrera, the study of the cubic form, and other books that Dali had used when he studied. Now, Dali was a master craftsman. He knew all the classical theories of art. And in fact, you can say that he knew them so well that he could distort them, because you really can't distort them well unless you know what they're supposed to be. So the classical theory of perspective was extremely important, and there was one book that turned out to be especially interesting. I'll make the connection because this object, which you don't see so often, is a sculpture that was produced in the same year as Corpus Hypercubicus, same year, 1954. And it's sort of it's a representation of an ordinary cross, but it's just given in terms of its edges. And the thing about it was that I recognized that that had been part of one of Dali's books on perspectives. And in fact, this picture here. It's absolutely clear that this is what Dali had in mind when he made that image. Now, it took me a while to see, to remember that. And what I didn't remember, because I had gone through this book rather quickly, was that he was interested in more than one view of the cross. And here are a whole bunch of views of the cross, including probably the beginning of the Christ of St. John of the Cross. But then there's one page that struck me in an absolutely incredible way, in this page here. Because what he had done was taking the two pictures of the cross on the top and put them together in the same exercise. So you had two crosses rotated 90 degrees around the z-axis, if you will, and we have a perspective picture of this object here, which is the unfolded hypercube. Well, the unusual thing about it is when this was written. When do you suppose this book was written? Well, the unfolded hypercube was a figure that was understood in the 19th century, late 19th century. And in the 1920s, there were mathematicians, geometers, who hung out with artists in the left bank. And Dali met these people. And I'm sure at one point somebody brought in a picture like this from the current literature at that time about the fourth dimension, and visualizing the fourth dimension. But Dali said, I've seen that before. And the book is old. Here's the book. Actually, here's a copy. Here's the actual picture. This is the actual copy of the cover. No, it's not the copy of the cover. It's the book, right? And the thing that's interesting is the date. Some people here know Latin. Okay. Professor O'Farrell, what year was this? 1750. Okay, 1750. Now, was M. de Sébastien Jorat interested in the hypercube when he did the traité de perspective à l'usage des artistes, the treatise on perspective for the usage of artists? No. He was simply interested in, looking at the three-dimensional object in several ways. But Dali certainly would be picking that up. I actually was able to buy this book for $100 on eBay because it was condition mauvaise, really bad condition. I mean, it was falling apart, right? Well, that's fine. I wanted to take it apart, right? And so here we are. This is the picture of the thing, which, from my point of view, answers the question, where did Dali get the image, and how did he connect it with things he already knew? My theory, that Linda Henderson, the absolute authority on these things, agrees with me, so I'm happy about that. Take a look at it again. You see that, we'll come back to it, you see that they're on the ground. If you project down, this is a shadow, which looks like the unfolded cross, unfolded cube. And so now we know where the figure came from, but that doesn't really answer the question about how he constructed the thing. We know the philosophical background, we know probably the genesis of the picture, but something I didn't realize is that Dali used photographs. And that becomes very clear. We're going to show another little clip from the film where the photograph shows how he got the picture of the Blessed Virgin looking up at the cross. The Blessed Virgin being, in this case, that's number three. Number three.
In 1955, 20 years before his meeting with Thomas Banchoff, Dali had already painted an unfolded hypercube. The hypercube is a four-dimensional geometric object, but we live in a three-dimensional world, and we cannot imagine these kinds of objects. However, we can understand them through mathematical approximations. In the same way as 4 segments of a line can be folded to make a square, 6 squares can be folded to make a cube. To make a 4-dimensional cube, a hypercube, we would have to fold 8 3-dimensional cubes. Both the Christ figure and the hypercube are tangible representations of a higher dimension. Dali had achieved his dream of merging art, science, and religion.
The idea of Corpus Hypercubus was to enlarge on the idea of St. John of the Cross. St. John of the Cross saw the crucifixion from the Father's aspect. Now, Dali wanted to project the idea of the sacrifice of Christ into the 4th dimension. In other words, to make it eternal.
The idea of unfolding the 4-dimensional cube into 3-dimensional space and seeing that as a representation of the crucifixion was Dali's genius. He saw it as an unfolding of the transcendental object into our ordinary world.
The main reason I really wanted to show that is the clip of the little art historian who said a couple of things that were interesting, but let me say that his position said 2 things. He talked about a projection of the 4th dimension into the 3rd dimension, and he talked about representing the eternal. Well, projections are one way that people do talk about higher dimensional objects into lower dimensional spaces. We saw that with the picture that came with the original Washington Post article. And we talked about it in terms of the cube within a cube. But this is not a projection. It's an unfolding. And that's a different way of looking at it. And the other thing he said is, in other words, to represent the eternal. Most people, if you ask them, say, I'm studying the 4th dimension, have a standard rejoinder. Everybody knows what it is, I'll bet. The 4th dimension, that's time, isn't it? And I teach my students, they're all on break right now, that's why I'm here, and they're supposed to go home and talk to a relative or a friend or somebody they meet, tell them they're taking a course right now on the 4th dimension, and I say they'll invariably hear that response. The 4th dimension, that's time, isn't it? And the rejoinder is, time is a 4th dimension, but it's not the 4th dimension. Everybody remember that. Time is a fourth dimension. It's not the fourth dimension. In particular, for Dali, it wasn't time at all that he was interested in. He's interested in limp watches. He's interested in the persistence of memory. And you'll see that again in the film. But that's not what this projection is about. Now, by the way, this is rather interesting because it's obviously related. This picture from the Vatican archives is a painting of a model. Now, you can bet that Salvador Dali did the same thing with this model that he did with his wife. He took a picture of her, and when he liked that picture, that became something that he painted. And it would be very difficult for a model to hold this pose for a long time. We actually know who the model was. He was a stuntman from American films who could hold unusual positions, and Dali found this and photographed it, made this picture, and this is one of the things he assembled to make the final picture. Now, the other thing that you see that he assembled was a model. And here he is in 1954-55 with the model that he had made of that hollow cross and the model he had made of the solid object, the cubes. This picture, a famous photograph by a very famous photographer, showed that Dali really liked this object. And indeed, if you take a look at it, you'll see some features of it that are interesting. It's wood with grain. They are solid cubes, not the model that I have. And there's a slight separation. The cubes are not flush against one another, but there's kind of a dowel that holds them slightly apart. And that kind of slightly apart thing was something that I think the wood joiner assembled, but Dali made something out of it. In fact, he kept that when he made his painting. And you can see that in the painting. The cubes are slightly apart from one another. Now, one of the things that Dali's genius is getting the shadows right, because he didn't have an artist standing in front of a big model. He had a model, he had artist, and he had his wife, and he had put all the shadows together. But he knew how to do that. I saw this painting, by the way. My wife and I were able to go to an exhibit in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania about 3 years ago, where this painting was on exhibit, and on exhibit in a way that was different from the usual way you see it. Usually, if you go into the Museum of Modern Art, you're kept at a certain distance. It's not quite Mona Lisa distance, but it's still a distance, and you can only look straight down on it. But here we were able to get right next to it. So I was able to get right next to it and see things that you couldn't see from a distance. The things that you could see were the guidelines he drew. You could actually see the lines because of the way the light was reflected on them that showed these 4 little cubelets at the end. You know, he was really part of a cube before he erased something from his scale drawing and put it together. So, you know, he really was using the full representation of a 3-dimensional object and then putting this other figure inside, suspended there. So it's an unfolding, and just it's transcendental, but for our benefit, it is folded out for us. Now, this is actually not as good a picture, you've noticed, as the previous ones I showed, because it's got glare in it. This is a photograph of my copy of the Corpus Hypercubicus, which is a $3 off-print that I bought in San Francisco. And I had it with me when I visited Dali. Now, I should say, as Ian Brunswick mentioned when he introduced the whole thing, that we met Dali not just once. I met him twice that first year. But every year for the next 10 years, he would contact us when he came to New York, or we saw him several times in New York, once in Paris, and 3 times in Spain. He would ask us to bring down what we were working on, and we would be able to see what he was working on. So you really got an insight into the choices of topics, but also the working methods. Now, at one point, I showed this to Dali, and he said, "Oh, let me sign it." So now it says, "Pour Banchoff, Hommage de Dali, 1976, the second year." And it's probably worth more than $3 now. Not much more, but in any case, it was interesting that he liked to occasionally give things away. For example, this little book, a Dali book, 1976 again, and Pour Mon Ami Banchoff, and a picture of St. George and the Dragon. Yes, Professor O'Farrell knows that we have a special statue of that in Maynooth, where I lectured yesterday. But this for Dali was something that he did when he wanted to personalize something or to change the copyright status of something. Let's see, this, for example, is a famous painting, and it shows a different aspect of Dali's interest in science. If you take a look at this and you're over 50, the best thing to do is just take your bifocals off. But if you're younger, or if you want, just squint very hard. Almost close your eyes, and you'll see what this picture really is. Okay? It's a full-color portrait of Abraham Lincoln. Everybody see Abraham Lincoln? Okay. As a matter of fact, of course, it's given away by this postage stamp little object in the lower left, which to me looks like about 400 gray squares. What this is a computer disenhanced picture. You take a photograph and you replace it by a bunch of little gray squares which average out various values, and your mind puts it back together. We're very good at that. We're very good at recognizing photographs. And part of it is that you get the features very quickly. Dali had seen this. This was from Bell Laboratories in the 60s, actually, put together, and realized that it had potential. I mean, for him, it was potential of doing something which he loved to do, which gives people a double vision, and he does that in many of his paintings. In this particular case, as I said, he made it into a picture called Gala looking out at the Mediterranean Sea, but it also has another name, the Dali Lincoln. The interesting thing for me is I saw this when it was half finished. I saw how he painted it. So in his studio that he had in the St. Regis Hotel, he had his painting up there, and he had a little pair of opera glasses, this little periscopes, little binoculars. And he turned them around so you'd look through the big end and look through the little end. And he could look at it and simulate what it would be like if you were 40 yards away. And that would meld it together into exactly the thing he wanted. And he'd look at it and he'd go up and change a little bit, come back, look at it, change a little bit. And he'd stop when he got the right view, said the right thing. So it was a rather amazing kind of an operation as it is. Now, very fast story about marketing. This was done as a poster, I guess you'd say, or it was reprint. And by the way, the St. John of the Cross is in the clouds up there, so there's more to it. He sold the whole thing. I think the whole printing was sold for $10,000, some silly number, because within a year, one particular issue was selling for $20,000 on the equivalent of eBay at that time. And so Dali did something which is allowable. He changed it by making a little drawing over here on the side that wasn't part of the original, and that made it a new thing, and he could sell that for what he wanted. Indeed, he learned all sorts of things by talking. He certainly had a good sense for dollars, as the film said. There's another picture here that was shown. We'll see again in the other film. The skull of Zurbaran. This is in the Guggenheim Museum, no, the Hirshhorn Museum in Washington, D.C. And for those of you who've been there, it's about the worst possible place to show this because the Hirshhorn is cylindrical and you can't get a long hallway. I mean, this should be at the end of a long hallway, and you come around and you see the skull, and then you get closer and see something else. But this is also very nice because psychologists use the floor. By the way, if you look out as you leave here, you'll see a floor pattern that's reminiscent of this. And of course, that is an optical illusion. You can see that cubical pattern in two different ways at least, and that's shown up above as you bring it out into the third dimension. And so indeed, it's some real interest in the psychology of vision and the physiology of vision. Dali had those as continued interests. This is the only painting that Dali did that actually has the fourth dimension in the title, à la recherche de la quatrième dimension, on search for research into the fourth dimension. It's the only time that he actually brought the limp watch into it. If you see the film next time, you'll see there's a considerable debate about whether the limp watch is a symbol of relativity or simply the melting of a brie cheese in the sun. Again, if you're interested in that debate, you'll see it in the next hour. What we have here is a couple of other representations, though. The two polyhedra sitting there, the two dodecahedra, are really part of a stereo pair. And so if you're good at that, you can actually fuse them in your mind and your vision. But of course, there'll be some retinal rivalry because one of them is solid and the other has figures on it. And Dali wanted to do that. Several of the paintings he did would do that. In the time he was doing the stereoscopic oil paintings, he would give you two paintings that were very, very similar in some ways, but were very different in other ways. And it was to you to put them together in your mind and make sense out of that. Again, his penchant for giving you challenges. He was very interested, of course, from the beginning in perspective. This is a picture from the gallery, from the museum down in St. Petersburg, Tampa, St. Petersburg, Florida, which is the Ghost of Vermeer, which can also be used as a table. And he came back to that in the 60s with this picture here. Again, this is one part of a stereo pair, so that you get a really extended version of the thing. It really looks like that leg, which was artificially extended, is very far extended. And here's Dali down below setting the whole thing up. So again, it's one of these things where you have realism and surrealism, a rather interesting kind of creative change. That led to an interesting project. People asked, did you ever do anything together with Dali? And well, we got a lot of good stories. This is 1980. And it's probably the most expensive, most dear thing I own because it's an original. And he signed it, Banchoff de Dali, 1980. The medium is magic marker on shirt cardboard, okay? So he was sketching on this piece of white cardboard, and he wanted to talk about an exercise in perspective. The exercise in perspective was to make a horse, a beautiful, beautiful picture of a horse. But you would come out from the side of the museum and see this horse looking down at you, a large statue, and looked perfectly fine until you moved to the side and realized the horse was actually 300 meters long, okay? And what were you seeing was the head-on view. Now here's the head-on view here of the horse. And now you see over here a man looking at the real horse, which looks reasonable close to him, but the rump is a full football field away, right? So that's interesting. Of course, it's an exercise in perspective. You can make almost anything work from one point of view, and you want to make the sculptor's challenge is to make it look good from other points of view as well. But in any case, here's another view of the same thing. Again, a man looking at a horse and being deceived because it's really so distended. So the rump would be some separate structure at a different distance. Now, the following year, 1981, he changed his mind by changing the scale. Now, this picture is not very good, but you can get some idea of it. The horse now, at the bottom here, the head is standing at a certain stage. The shoulders would be about 300 meters away, and the rump would be 300 kilometers away. It would be on the top of a mountain, okay? So in the background, you have Toledo or something. And so we've gone up another scale. Now, the joke is, if there's any joke involved, that if you have a good model of the first one, you have a good model of the second one. You're just changing scale, that's all. And the next year, it was in Paris, and Dali really wasn't doing too well that particular year. He got better later on, but he was sketching this, which was another change of scale. This was supposed to be built so that the front part of the horse would be built so in front of you, right? But if you looked up, the shoulders would be on a mountain, and the rump would be on the moon. Okay, so we changed the scale again, 10 more times. In any case, a number of times. So you'd only be able to see the statue looking like a real horse if you stay not only in the right place, but at the right time. Okay, so it's really nice, right? Now, it's pretty clear that's never going to be built, right? I mean, even Dali kind of agreed that he had taken it pretty far. And so I tell my students, I teach a course every other year, a seminar for students in humanities and social sciences and some mathematics students on exploring the fourth dimension. Right? My students have just finished their 9th week, reading 1 chapter a week of my book, and now the last 4 weeks they will have a final project. I said to my students at the end of this little sequence in chapter 6 that obviously no one will ever build that horse. Now, you don't say that to a student, right? We're going to build a horse. So one of the projects, I should have gone a little bit ahead. Charles Strauss and I were supposed to investigate all this thing. We provided images for him. This is one of the things, very crude kind of thing, but we wanted to show different views of a horse. This is the Trojan soldier's view of a horse, okay? The world from the inside of a horse, right? Anyway, of course we could make the pictures, and as I said, the pictures that we made were good for all the different representations, but this is the horse my students made. Yeah, it's kind of a nice little pony, you know, looking at you, and it's reasonably proportioned, papier-mâché object. But as you walk to the side, it starts getting suspicious. Okay? And walk a little bit more to the side, it's even more suspicious. There's 3 separate pictures of things, exactly as Dali had in mind. This is the side view. Actually, in that big white space, there was a chair, that the miracle of Photoshop, my wife was able to remove it, so we have a full picture of the way this horse illusion works. And only by returning do you actually see the horse itself. We brought it up from the basement just a week and a half ago, so my students could each take a turn getting exactly the right position to see the horse and to see that indeed the representation works in every dimension. We didn't, we did the dimensions in the sense of scale. So that's kind of a pleasant way to see that challenges that mathematicians and artists can't do right away, students can always achieve. Right? And there they are with their construction. Very happy. Now, there's another clip I'd like to show, Danny, from the film, because it really shows the end of our interaction.
The St. Regis was Dali's headquarters in New York.
The bar itself was set up as a stage for Dali. People would come up to him and he would speak to them in French or Spanish or Catalan. So it was really difficult to understand, but people didn't care. The effect was what was important. But when he was really serious, he talked to you in his room. He had specific questions to ask. He knew the background. He would ask the questions in a way that was quite understandable. If you were even confused at all, he would repeat, and he would ask you to repeat if you said something that he didn't get the first time. So the emphasis was on communication, whereas the emphasis for a lot of the people who visited him was showmanship.
Gala died in 1982. Dali fell ill. He left his home in Portugal and set up in Pubol, where Gala had spent the last years of her life. His friend Tom Banchoff paid him a visit there.
In May of 1983, we came here to the castle in Pubol to show our films and new objects to Dali. The nurses brought him and made him comfortable in a chair right here. And after he was ready, we showed our first film, the Veronese surface. Dali was familiar with these images and aware of the fact that they look very different from very different points of view. As the object rotates in four-dimensional space, we see a number of situations that Dali very much appreciated. He would say that is marvelous when he would see something that approached a point of high visual ambiguity, which then resolved. Sometimes the object in the middle has three cusps.
This is very important because Dali recognized that the three cusps showed that we were near an umbilic catastrophe that was studied by René Thom.
René Thom was one of Dali's long-standing friends. This French mathematician, winner of the Fields Medal, the equivalent of the Nobel Prize, developed a whole new branch of mathematics, catastrophe theory. The curves expressing Thom's equations appear in Dali's last paintings.
Well, nice story. I'd like to say a little bit more about the catastrophe theory and the interaction with the other mathematician that Dali had the most contact with, René Thom, and then I'd like to bring it up to the present day. And we're set to do that in about 8 more minutes. Just wanted to give people ahead of time. We stopped a little bit short. This picture here is a picture that brought Dali and René Thom together. It's a high perspective study of the Gare de Perpignan, the station in a portion of southern France, which is well known to geologists because there are 3 tectonic plates that come together just at that point. And that is evidence of at least the setup of what the geologists call a catastrophe. Catastrophe for René Thom was not necessarily something dire or disastrous, but interesting, catastrophe, something challenging. And the challenge came from mathematics. This is René Thom, and his work covered a great number of areas, but the catastrophe surface here represented in famous slide sequence from Christopher Zeeman from, at that time, Warwick and then Oxford, shows how the catastrophes, which later on were applied to all sorts of areas, it really started in very simple mathematics where you wanted to study the shapes of curves. And the shapes of curves here, if we had a lot of time, we could show how moving a pointer on the control space over here on the left would change the shape on the right. The control space down below was the equations that, the derivatives of the equations that René Thom had written up on the blackboard, on the whiteboard. But that really, even though that's what he used to illustrate a catastrophe theory, was not as important because what he really was interested in was the 5th degree equation. I had seen photographs of this, but in October last year in Bergamo at the Bergamo Scienza, a 2-week celebration of science and its applications, we actually were able to see in Milan this particular painting. It's the only painting that Dali ever painted where there's an actual formula in the bottom here, but this is supposed to make you think of the geological catastrophes. But this photograph, this image right here, sets up the study of a set of equations, or 5th degree equations. The one on the right is just x to the 5th, but over on the left, the control space is 3-dimensional, and indeed, if we take that picture, we can see that changing the position of that little dot by moving it around in computer graphics gives us a very different 5th order equation, the one on the right-hand side. The important part here is, though, that if you take a look at that relatively complicated object that you're moving around in 3-dimensional space in order to change the shapes, you see a little fishtail kind of thing, which is actually part of a 3-dimensional thing called a swallowtail, a coup de ronde, swallowtail catastrophe. It looks like a bird's tail. And that image, the swallowtail catastrophe, really impressed Dali. He really liked it. And it showed up in his work, in particular in the final painting. Here is the final painting. This was from a magazine, just a week and a half, appeared just a week and a half before we visited him for the last time in Pubal, the thing that was recorded in that little film. And if we take a look at it, you realize this painting, which is listed as the last painting completed by Dali, is mathematics, and for that matter, some religion. Because what you have is this coup de ronde, this kind of fishtail shape, that's related to the cubic form, this S shape, The elongated S is the integral sign from integral calculus. He had a cello next to his easel, and of course you get the cuts in the cello. You get Dali's mustaches. You get a little thing down here where you have a cubic curve with an inflection point. He also had a book by René Thom on theory of catastrophes next to his easel, and he also had a book on cusps of Gauss mappings, which was our book. So I really felt very good about having some influence on the choices of images that he was choosing. But the idea that the cul de ron becomes also a chalice was for him a religious symbol brought together again with a mathematical symbol. The coda is that in 2004 we were able to visit Barcelona, and we were able to visit Figueres. Figueres is the town where the Dali Museum is situated in Spain, very close to Cadaqués and Puerto Lligat, where Dali was raised. And so here's the museum, Dali 2004, and in the film I actually show a model of the Hypercube where I say it was made shortly after my first visit with Dali. And the reason I had that new Hypercube shortly after my first visit is that when I showed the Hypercube to Dali, the Unfolded Hypercube, he was fascinated with it. He played with it. And he said, "I may have this." It wasn't a question. Somehow it was, I may have this, And then he explained that he was just starting his museum and he wanted to put this in the museum. So if we have the object here, you can see that in that little vitrine, that little case, there's a version of this made out of metal. But you see some other things. In particular, you see the actual model, the actual cubical model sitting next to it. It's a little funny because this thing has a motion to it that's interesting to mathematicians and scientists. It's a kind of a universal joint, and I don't know exactly why it does this. But if you are in Figueres and you put a coin, I guess a 20 centavo coin, in that little slot next to my sweater there, it will actually make the thing move around, and it plays liturgical music in the background. It's really campy. It's very funny. But there it is on the second floor. Here's another view of the same thing, and there's the picture of the corpus hypercubicus in the back to make sure that people understood what was happening. The mechanism that makes the turn is a kind of a rod that moves around. And Dali put a crucifix there, which I thought was an interesting kind of a terminology. Anyway, he's fun. He enjoyed making things fun. Now, in that museum, there is a recreation of his working studio. And I think I should say that a lot of the work on this actual image here was done by people working with him. But all the ideas are Dali's. There's no one in his retinue had any concepts of mathematics, but they could follow instructions. And Dali was shaking by this time. It would be very difficult for him to do that fine work, but that was there. An illustration of the fact that the people have very little mathematical sense is the image that they produced to show here, the reproduction. What's wrong with this reproduction? It's reversed left to right. Okay, they didn't see any different. I mean, it looks the same to them. In any case, this is the real thing. And so you can see that indeed it does what it's supposed to do. And that's it. Thank you very much.
We have time for just a few questions before we take a break, and we have some microphones. So if you do have a question, just raise your hand, and we'll get a microphone to you. So just wait for that. But to just kick it off, I might ask, when you first at that meeting, when you first met him, and you were talking with him, can you tell us, what was that first moment when you realized this wasn't just, come to New York, I'd like to, talk to you and meet you. It was, this is going to continue. This is going to go on. There's something more here.
Well, I can say that we didn't know that at first. A lot of the visitors were ephemeral. They'd come in, out. And it was really only the Raymond Law connection, which I think put us into synergy, right? It happened at that point. And at that stage, he realized that we not only had the unfolded cube and some slides, but we actually had some films. And he made us come back the following week. He bade us to come back the following week. I should say, in the meantime, comment I wanted to make, because we're talking about the relationship of mathematics and science, when I came back and told this story to Charles Strauss and his mentor, Andy Van Dam, the guru of graphics at Brown, Van Dam said, well, every computer scientist knows Raymond Law. You know, he was the one who did all this two-dimensional Kabbalistic material that became the basis of Babbage's computing engine at the end of the 19th century. So in a sense, these symbols show up in many different ways and affect people different ways. I should say that, as I mentioned in that little film that you saw, that one of the things that was difficult was to try to understand what he was saying sometimes. Because as people would come in, he would speak to them in French or Spanish or English or Catalan or Italian or 5 or 6 different languages. And then he would tell them to sit somewhere, you know, as though they were this big, sort of big circle, about 20 people by the time, but we were right next to him. And at the end, he really wanted to follow up. And so, as I said, each year he was the one who called us. We never called him. That we shared.
Well,
somebody else, please.
Yeah, do we have any questions from the audience? Just raise your hand if you do.
Come on.
Don't be bashful now.
Okay, here we are.
Down here, so.
This gentleman is interested in science. We'll warn you ahead of time.
Sorry, I just wanted to say thank you very much for a fascinating lecture.
Thank you.
Could you give us some sense of how was Salvador Dali frustrated trying to express multi-dimensional work?
Well, I don't even have to repeat the question. I think that Dali actually felt that he had been somewhat successful in getting across the idea. I mean, I think he didn't really explain it to other people except to give me this clue from Raymond Law. But the idea that he had seen that image, put it together in a new way, and felt that this was a way to express transcendence developed for our use, or for our benefit, was what he wanted to say. He, again, when he gave his homage to Juan de Herrera, wanted to say that he represented that this sequence from Law to Herrera to Dali. And so I think he thought he probably did it there, too. I don't know how he felt about the fact that, as far as I know, no art historian has ever made the connection between that picture and a four-dimensional cube. He was frustrated with the reception that people gave to his paintings. I mean, sometimes people just dismissed him because they could think of the most outrageous thing he had done and wouldn't really pay attention to what he was able to say with a new vision. And that bothered him. It bothered him when someone, as I say, when he lost out on that one painting that he had done and somebody sold it, sold all the things without him being properly recognized. That bothered him. He liked to say that he was the world's richest living artist, and that was something for him. It was somewhat earlier that he was doing things like making pictures of how do you want to put it, in show windows and things of that sort, very commercial things. And of course, he had been discounted by the Surrealist movement at earlier times, and that pained him. But he generally felt pretty good about choosing topics that challenged people. He was always looking for new things and ways to interact with scientists, which is really something. Yeah. Another question, yes?
Oh, yeah, just wait for the mic. And I think there's one up here as well.
Thanks again for a wonderful talk, really excellent. We're trying to overhaul maths education in Ireland at the moment by making it more applicable and having more real world or real life kind of questions that secondary school students can work on. Do you think we should be explicitly trying to put in current research, like your talk today, for high school students or secondary school students to kind of pique their interest in it a little bit more?
Well, I certainly think so, yes, because I try to do that myself all the time. But I wouldn't limit it just to applications of the traditional sort, like biology and economics and physics, or to other parts of mathematics. But the interesting thing to put people in contact with shapes and forms, like in architecture or in art or in visualization. The concept, the previous gentleman told me as I was asking people why they came, why they were here. A number of you said you were interested in science, a number said they were interested in Dali, and a number of people said both. You're the scientist and your brother next to you was the artist, right? So it seems to me that in each case, what you want to do is get people to rethink things in new ways and provide phenomena that they can study and relate to. So it's the connection with phenomena that's important, not specifically the fact that this is good for the national product. I mean, it would be nice to solve the bank crises in your country and ours, and mathematics will be a part of that, no question about it. It's nice to have spokespeople who will state that and talk about the importance of having models. Several of my students have gone on to careers in computer animation in the world of cinema. And the people who are most involved in that will stand up in front of an audience like this and say that if you want to do cinema or video games or anything, what you should do is spend as much time as you can ingesting maths and science, because that's really the background you need. You want to be creative, but you want to put your creativity to work by understanding how to communicate with people who do the computer graphics. You don't have to be a computer graphics person yourself to learn how to communicate with those people, these people. And that's been a challenge, but a really good challenge. So again, good luck with maths in the United States and in Ireland. Yes, you have a question down here?
And yeah, one more here.
Thank you very much for a fantastic talk. I enjoyed it even as much as the first time, more than the first time in Bergamo. So I have a question. Basically, Dali was inviting you to pick your brain.
Yes.
And then you said that, and I think it was very fascinating to hear from you that you shared. So you share your research with him, and he shared his unfinished work with you.
Yeah.
So was there a situation where you picked his brain and his work inspired your work?
Well, it's interesting. I certainly picked his brain in that very first meeting to try to solve the problem which I had posed for myself, which was, again, how, why, and in what way was this painting conceived and carried out. So in a sense, he was very, very helpful in that. As it happens, his interest at the end, and now Professor Silvio Giordani from the nanotechnology and nanochemistry here in the same building upstairs, was present at my conference in Bergamo. And I was very happy there to go to the exhibit in Milan to see that particular painting, of that is simply, white on white with the equation in the bottom. I must admit, doesn't thrill very many people, but it thrilled me because it really inspired me then to try to figure out how to explain to my students why he was interested, again, how he did it, and what the connections were with, Professor René Thom, whose work, again, is something that I've been interested in for some time, but it gave me a new view of that work. So I don't know that either of us, except for the horse, ever really attacked the same problem at the same time. But we didn't have to. I mean, it really was an easy relationship. He was picking my brains, but he certainly was not, it was not one-sided. I was able to pick his, and as he would show something that he was working on, he would describe it. And that was very interesting to see how an artist works. He would look at our films, and he would make these comments. As I said, the people around him had no mathematical background or comprehension. And when he would say merveilleux, it's marvelous, marvelous, the umbilic hyperbolique, and they thought he was, losing it, And I said, no, he knows exactly what he's saying, exactly what he's seeing. He recognized these forms, and he was fascinated with the forms in computer graphics, as I was. So it was more that we were both mutually appreciating some of the same stimuli rather than prodding each other. I think.
Just a curiosity, because a curiosity. Any situation where, let's say, if you didn't agree with him, like, how would he react?
If I didn't agree with him, how would he react? Well, he wasn't the one who disagreed with me. It was his wife who disagreed with me. Gala, who was 10 years older than Dali, had 13 rings on her hands at one point. I counted them. Was very suspicious of this fourth dimension business. And she, I'd meet her and she'd say, fourth dimension. And he would say, no, it's all right. And see, he didn't have to believe it or disbelieve it. He knew that it was a stimulating concept for me and for him. And but she was maybe he had put her up to it. I don't think so. She was the one who was challenging whether it existed or not. Now, he didn't care whether it exists or not, and frankly, neither do I. There are physicists who really care about whether it exists or not. Mathematicians don't talk about existence except in the idea of an idea existing in the mind of God, and we have a glimpse of it, the pure Platonic forms. Most of us are Platonists. And so, it worked for Dali as a stimulus. It works for me as a stimulus. And I think we had an understanding at a level that we never convinced his wife. Never convinced her.
I think we have time for maybe one, maybe two more questions, and we have two at the back on each side. So let's just go with those, and then we'll have our break.
We have a gentleman in the front.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
Let's get to the back first.
We'll squeeze in three. Yeah, so maybe.
Yes.
Hi, I just wanted to ask, Dali clearly understood the visualizations of multidimensional objects and that. In your discussions with him, did you get any idea that he was mathematically literate, that he understood the mathematics behind your work?
That's an interesting question because he certainly understood what I would say a little bit beyond the scientific American knowledge of various subjects. And you can see that when you see the film if you come back to watch the Dali dimension. I think that what happened to him is similar to what happens to me and as I read some mathematical things. I'll go along reading something that I don't know very well, and I'll get to an interesting example or perhaps a question that I ask. And then I work away and I doodle away and I try to figure out a way to understand the thing that was bothering me or that was puzzling me, to try to find a new way of doing it. Sometimes I never get back to the rest of the paper. And sometimes I write my own paper after getting some insight onto another way of explaining the same thing. I suspect that that's really the way he worked, that he would see something, perhaps in a geometry book, on the left bank, Paris, and say, it makes a connection with this and this and this, and then play with that, move away from it. Whether he'd ever go back and read the next chapter of the book, I don't know. I don't think he ever read mathematics for pleasure, but he read mathematics to get the pleasure of a new insight or new image. So, I think he was literate in an interesting way, but it was literate because it worked for him to be able to read enough to get an idea that you wouldn't get if you didn't put that effort in. Okay. Question?
Hello. Hi. Firstly, compliments on the sartorial connection with your necktie and the
yes.
and the lecture.
Thank you. I bet everybody saw the necktie. That's from Philadelphia Museum of Art. Thanks for pointing it out.
Secondly, I just wanted to ask you just about there's been a kind of the direction universities have taken recently has been to very much separate between the sciences and the humanities and the arts. Even in this university, we're over in the science end now, and you have to take a good 10-minute walk to get to the arts end. How do you, and the two groups of students don't really are two different breeds. How do you think we can achieve a kind of a synergy between students of the arts and of the sciences, and what kind of forum can you bring that about in?
That's certainly a very good question, and I know it means it's a different kind of question in different countries. And you can give me more of an effort of this, but a view of this, but I think you have a better chance in Ireland than the continent, or even closer. because at most of the places I've visited, in Great Britain or in France or Germany or Romania, if a student goes to college and is interested in mathematics, he or she will take nothing but mathematics or very, very closely related subjects. Whereas in Ireland, again, my experience is limited, but in Maynooth, students start out by taking 2 or even 3 subjects in the first year. And an art student may very well take mathematics. The second year, they'll cut down to 2 subjects or maybe 1. In the third year and above, it's primarily the concentration, which is quite similar in a sense to what happens in the United States, where students are required to, depending on what institution you're in, required to take 4 or 5 different kinds of subjects in their first year, and then gradually work down to a major or concentration toward the end. I think that the idea that people in the very beginning of a college experience should have at least 2 or 3 different foci is very, very helpful, because even though you might know a lot coming from secondary school, you're really receptive in a different way when you're in college. And so I think that concept of being able to see humanities and arts and economics and social science and physical and biological science, mathematics somewhere, is very, very, very beneficial. Now, I don't know, again, you can have arguments in the United States about to which extent you want to make sure everybody has that. Some of our sister institutions in the United States in the so-called Ivy League have a very strict core curriculum, making you absolutely certain that by the time people have finished 4 years of undergraduate school, they've had at least 6 courses in humanities and 6 courses in economics and 6 courses in this and 6 courses in that. I'm from University Brown, where we have no requirements at all, except you have to concentrate ultimately. But in the beginning, you're given free rein to choose those areas that you're supposed to do. And as I say, the freshman seminar course I'm teaching right now, which I've taught maybe 15 times in the last 20 years, has students from, well, I have students who are art students and philosophy students and economics students, as well as engineers and mathematics students, who get together to be mutually stimulated by the art, in one case, the literature, the philosophy, theology, the science, and the mathematics. I think opportunities like that are really very valuable. It's what I consider a really good part of what we treasure in the spirit of liberal education. And so, again, to delay that period of ultimate concentration, which you have to go into if you're going to be a physicist or a chemist or a mathematician or a philosopher or a poet, you have to have that concentration, but not too soon. So I don't know whether that really helps to answer the question, but insofar as you can continue to be interested in outside things and not let your concentration dominate, that's better education from my point of view. Yes, sir.
It is a fascinating account of an artist transforming mathematical knowledge into something that can be perceived by the ordinary person, experienced maybe more by the ordinary person. If we had more of that, maybe we could could accelerate the second Renaissance. But one question I have, I've always looked for artists who would take on the challenge of doing the same thing for software. So what is software? How can that be represented? It's something that we don't really understand, just like quantum mechanics. We don't really understand. It's scientific, it's structural, it's mathematical. Are you aware of any such similar attempts to what you have been part of?
The question about how we take fundamental concepts in computer science, the kind of algorithms, the kind of challenges to explain how you're going to do something so that you not only teach another person but teach the machine how to do it, is one of the fundamental challenges. The concept of machine intelligence Or, as one of my colleagues points out, if there's machine intelligence, there has to be machine stupidity. You really want to learn how it is that machines can operate. There's no question about the fact that they can mimic many of the things that we do, and there are also many ways of seeing that it can't completely replace the kind of interaction. So the man-machine or person-machine interaction itself becomes fundamental for us. I'm involved in a couple of projects of writing books for mathematics, but they're not really books in the sense that if you take a book as a linear thing that you page through, it's a totally different thing than a software program that enables you to have a focus here, but you can move to the left or the right into a more elementary or more complicated object, or you can move forward and backward in difficulty of topics. You can change the dimension. All these things are models that are built into relationships between ideas, among ideas. And software challenges are very similar to that. Not exactly the same, but we can learn a lot by studying those. I don't know how close that comes to answering your question, but the people in the United States were very fascinated a couple of weeks ago by a contest in the game Jeopardy, where there was an IBM machine which would take questions that were asked in normal language, in fact, sometimes tricky language, and parse them, not only parse them grammatically, but they could actually make allusions and connections, thousands and hundreds of thousands of connections in a very short time, and sometimes answer questions faster than the champion people. I know that you have a memory expert coming as part of the big effort here to study memory. And again, the kinds of things that pit the human being against a machine are very interesting challenges and gives us an insight into both. So in a sense, I think we can learn a lot by answering and asking these questions.
Yeah, I think we've got another talk on software and art there, another talk on education policy, but we're going to have to leave it there. Do stick around. We're going to have a quick break if you want to for a screening of the Dali Dimension, but we're going to have to conclude the event, so let's have a big round of applause for Tom Banchoff.
Thank you. Thank you.